Great. So thank you all for giving up your morning or afternoon or evening, depending on what part of the world you're dialing in from. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional peoples of whatever lands you're dialing in from. Where I am, it's the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne, in Australia. When I think about the links between behaviour and systems, and particularly that need to find that co-equilibrium between social, environmental, and economic sustainability, we have a lot to learn from the traditional owners of different countries around the world. And in some ways, I think we're trying to reverse engineer that stuff by using behavioural science and policy and science to bring it all together. But into the talk. So yeah, this is partly a very brief primer and a few thoughts about systems and behaviour change, but it's primarily intended to be a discussion where we hear a bit from each of you about your experiences, and I'll explain what that's about as we get into it. Thank you for the introduction, Selena. Yeah, I think one thing you can sort of know about me is, in a lot of ways, I'm trying to work out my relationship with my mum and my dad in my research. My dad was an American ad man who moved to Australia. My mum was a first feminist social ecologist PhD in a university program, and first in her family. And so I guess for a long time, I've been interested in that intersection between how do we persuade and delight people into doing things, but also how does that feed into more systemic and identity and values driven stuff as well. You gave a very nice summary of some of my background. So I'll focus more of the questions that have driven me through my career. When I was working at a PhD, and I studied in a field called human ecology, which is very much about the interactions between people and nature. And back then I was sort of thoughtful about how do we achieve sustainability, and is it by making it as easy as possible for people, or for pursuing transformational critical change? And while I was doing what ended up being a very theoretical PhD, I was also working for my university's Green Office program, trying to get people to switch off lights and shift transport modes and so on. And that's probably where I started to get a bit interested in the applied work of behaviour change. I don't know if you guys are hearing that in the background, but my kids might be murdering each other in the background, but just try and ignore that.
We can't hear anything, don't worry.
Then nothing's happening, don't worry. Yeah. And I guess in a lot of ways, my career is still about trying to understand that difference between, do we try and make it as easy as possible for people, or do we seek more transformative, reflexive kinds of changes as well? But towards the end of my PhD, I really didn't want to stay in academia, I realised, and an interesting looking job popped up at the Victorian Environment Protection Authority. It's a state-based environmental regulator here in Victoria and Australia. And I ended up moving into government. And then all of a sudden, my world was very much one where I was really being asked things like, oh, great, a social researcher, that's really helpful. Can you do us a survey? I think so. I actually hadn't done a lot of surveys at that point. What's it about? Well, we've been doing this program on contaminated land management, and we want to know if it worked. Like, oh, okay, yeah, cool. So when do you need the survey? Well, our last workshop for the last 3-year program is tomorrow. And yeah, the conversation would go from there. And I feel like I spent a lot of that period trying to talk people out of doing surveys, to be honest. But what it really underlined to me was that we really need good frameworks so that people working in government, particularly in programmatic, implementation-oriented environments like regulators, to ask good questions that research can help with. And that's when I really got very interested in behavioural science and evaluation frameworks and so on. And around that time, about 3 years in, some people from Monash University who were pretty friendly with our senior leadership approached about forming a behavioural science group to pursue questions of how can public sector agencies use behavioural science to drive change. And yeah, around that point, I wasn't quite ready for that kind of partnership. I just secured a nice budget to do social and behavioural research, and all of a sudden it was all being spent on this partnership. But over about 7 years, I did about 24 different projects with what would become Behaviour Works, on everything from how do we get people to pay attention to beach water quality signage, to getting fuel retailers to voluntarily measure and report their risk of leaks, to getting large corporations to do accurate and timely reporting of their annual compliance statements, and everything in between that you can imagine. Moving over to the university context again, towards the end of about 10 years there, well, I was recruited to ask this question of how can we use behaviour change to address shared multi-agency challenges, which got me into the circular economy and waste space. And I think you've previously heard from my colleague Jenny, who worked with me on some of those early projects and has really made it her own now, so doing incredible things. That was when we sort of started to look at these questions of how do we look at this shared problem across multiple agencies and jurisdictions using a behaviour change lens, and that led to some of the chapters you might have seen in our Behaviour Works method book and things like that as well. And so, yeah, ever since then, I've really been interested in this question of how do we understand these multi-level challenges that face us in terms of going from a very high material energy impact society to one that's more sustainable. And how can a behaviour change lens help us unpick that? And I'll explain to you a bit more about that as we go. The project motivating this talk, though, it's a bit more in the vanilla behavioural science space. And the aim of it is we're really trying to seek to document and share practice-based responses to complexity and systems change from people working with behaviour change and applied behavioural science. It's something I'm able to do through a university sort of talent accelerator program thing, which basically gives you a little bit of money to do a project no one else will fund you to do. So this is what I chose to spend it on. And essentially looking at practical responses to systems and complexity from people working in practice, often in a government context, but not necessarily limited to it, but certainly with that public good, pro-social kind of focus. We're a little way into the project now. I've run a workshop at a conference. It was the International Association of Economic Psychologists conference in Estonia mid this year in June. As part of the same trip, I got to meet with one of the BSI team in her day job, Julia, at the FAO, and interview her team, and also did some interviews with people in their organisation. Got to meet wonderful people like Marion and Colin. I think I saw Marion's name on the call here, but Marion's one of the authors of the EU Commission's How to Make Better Use of Behavioural Science Work in Public Policy, which I'll mention a bit more in a moment. Ran a great workshop, which was pretty well received by the participants. And this is sort of a reprise of that. When Julia approached me about doing a talk, I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to talk to people working in the environment space about their experiences and try and capture that. And I understand there's also a intersection with a systems group in your organisation as well. So hoping to build network and connections, work with people working on this, potentially develop new frameworks and synthesis approaches to behaviour and transitions. Very interested in creating a practical catalogue of useful options and strategies and when people use them as well out of this work. We do have a new Masters of Behaviour and Systemic Change that people like myself and Jenny and others are feeding into at Monash, and so we're going to apply some of this stuff into there. And the usual academic grist of publications and grant applications and so on. So if any of that's exciting to you, don't be shy about reaching out. As many of you will be aware, this kind of thing is worth talking about because there's some long-running academic critiques of behavioural science and complex policy problems, some of which you might feel are relevant, some of which might seem a bit abstract, and that's part of what we're here to discuss. But my particular summary of them is that there's a sense that your classic behavioural science approaches tend to oversimplify and neglect systemic factors that can be related to things like disciplinary exclusion and even colonisation. It's probably less recognised in things like Horsworth's books, but certainly paper, but certainly highlighted in the I-frame and S-frame, for example. And people like sociologists and practice theorists have pointed out that we also tend to responsibilise and individualise problems and neglect the influence of powerful actors such as business, government and civil society in shaping and limiting people's behavioural options. There's also the perception that behavioural science is only about nudge, where of course anyone who's worked in a mixed government setting knows that you very rarely get to do a pure nudge experiment, and it's very much about trying to make traditional policy tools work. And there's this sense that it might lead to the neglect of full range of policy and program interventions. There's also the sense that by not taking a more systemic approach, we're more likely to cause unintended consequences and flow-on effects. There's a very real problem of modest short-term and or unreplicable impacts that's widely talked about. The ethics of using more less explicit or non-transparent approaches to change behaviour, and the fact that a lot of the research and approaches do tend to be based on Western educated, essentially university students that European and North American scientists could do experiments on to come up with their theories. So I think these are all relevant and valid criticisms to a degree, but we're also seeing some really interesting engagement and responses to some of these challenges, which I think really peaked sort of early last year. Many of you will be aware of the BESARA behavioural systems report that came out. There's our book from Behavioural, which I think has an early look at how to integrate systems approaches into it, but we're moving past that now. Neat things out of the OECD, and Marion and her colleagues recently produced this in Feb last year, which I think is a really interesting look at the interface between behavioural science and public policy design across the EU. And I think, part of what interests me and drives this project is the sense that maybe the academic conversation has missed the practice experience. I certainly know from my own experience and the people I've worked with over the years that a lot of BI practitioners do routinely apply behavioral science approaches into complex and dynamic problems, and often they're part of multidisciplinary teams, and that can have its challenges, but often leads to good things. And at times, not always, and maybe it's the exception, they do get to deeply reframe policy and program design implementation with insights from behavioral science. And as the Basara framework points out, this can be taking the mode of zooming in, so better representing people's end users' experience of programs and policies and technologies so that they're better understood and incorporated into things, but it also be from the zooming out and looking from the system in through things like modeling and more qualitative behavioral system mapping and better understanding the structural constraints and broader behavioral drivers that shape and are shaped by people's behavior. And similarly, in that great report that Marion and colleagues produced, there's some really nice discussion of the different layers of analysis and different configurations of policy and behavioral science that can be applied too. So all of this leads me to say, well, we should be talking more and listening and documenting and sharing across practitioners and the work we're doing about what challenges and tensions are we experiencing and to what extent does it align with some of these academic discussions, and are there more pressing issues that are being missed by some of the academic stuff that's practical as well. Also, what practical solutions, innovations and workarounds people have been developing, and what capabilities and tools and approaches do we need as a field to do our best work on tricky problems? Where are there some gaps? What are things we're doing a bit of but need more help with? And so that's really the thrust of the discussion we want to have in a minute. But this is not purely an extractive exercise, and I wanted to share with you a little bit of what we heard from the previous workshop, for example. So in that group of, I think it was around 15 or 16 behavioural public policy practitioners from the EU, from national governments, a few from universities and the like, the issues of modest, short-term and unrecoverable results loomed large. The challenge of insufficiently interdisciplinary approaches and overly simplistic was there as well, and also neglecting structural change interventions and additional policy tools. I was going to include some of the early results of the survey, but there wasn't very many in there, so I don't want to give misleading results for this group. But the early indications were that this group was a bit more interested in the neglect of structural change interventions and also the modest short-term and unrecoverable results. But I can share some of that stuff after the event as another incentive for you to complete the survey too. And some of the strategies and methodologies, design thinking, getting into policy cycles early, various forms of visualization and mapping of systems really loomed large, alongside of other things. So, that's a very light touch insight into the kinds of things I'm hoping we'll be discussing when we break into the groups. Two quick tools I can share with you that I've been involved in developing that might be useful. We've recently had a paper published where we've tried to integrate a social ecological approach with the capability, opportunity, motivation equals behavior approach from UCL group. And essentially what we've done there, if you're familiar with the behavior change wheel and the like, is we've looked at the opportunity wedge of the behavior change wheel and said, well, we really need to take into account more of these nested hierarchical systems of different kinds that shape things and incorporate that kind of thing into literature reviews, into qualitative and survey research to better understand how barriers and drivers extend beyond the individual and shape them. And so, yeah, encourage you to have a look at that. Essentially what we're saying there is that, wicked problems have complexity, uncertainty and systemic characteristics, which mean you do need to take into account a more holistic, inclusive approach. Traditional models such as COM-B do tend to focus on individuals and do tend to look primarily at the individual level, but a systems approach encourages to recognizing interconnections and how the local environment is shaped by its interactions with others. And so we try to integrate both in addressing practical real-world challenges. And that paper describes how we've applied it in 3 different projects across gender equity and diversity inclusion in Vietnam, changing farmers' engagement with natural capital markets in Australia, and also better representing traditional owners' views in local government adaptation planning. Part of this stuff reflects that, as you're probably aware, behavioural science works best when we apply it to relatively simple or complicated problems at most, and we need ways of comprehending and dealing with more complex and wicked problems. And so this tries to extend our tools to better understand the range of factors that might drive different behavioural outcomes and make decisions about where to do interventions and so on. I would say it's a complement to, not a replacement for things like system mapping, but it helps you in those exploratory phases when you're trying to make sense of different evidence and insights as to what's going on and why is it or easy hard to do these things. So a project I'll tell you about now where we applied it working with engaging farmers in biodiversity and carbon markets here in Australia. Yeah, we're looking at questions of, well, what do they specifically have to do? And in this case, it's a relatively complicated set of chained behaviours to assess their natural capital potential, to monitor and baseline it, to make changes to their farm, to implement land management practices, and then to do various economic participation activities to try and get it in there. And so you have to look at the whole thing as a chain of adoption rather than an individual. And you also have to understand how different barriers and drivers interact with that. And by looking at it in this way, you end up having to think about, well, yes, there's short-term target behavior changes, but that's influenced by these longer-term systems that enable and constrain what they're doing. So when we surveyed some of the participants in one of the programs we were working with, and we looked particularly at people who were involved in environmental markets compared to who weren't, we saw some interesting patterns when we looked across these different systems. So everyone was experiencing difficulty understanding the complexity of the market schemes and fears about opportunity cost and contract lock-ins and the like, frustration that they couldn't count existing good work they've done because of the additionality problem in the policies. But the people who were not yet involved in markets, they were particularly suspicious and concerned about the role of market brokers and aggregators who were trying to persuade them to get involved in these market schemes. And that baseline measurement, proving that they had a natural capital improvement in carbon or biodiversity was too hard to do. And the costs, the upfront costs, the unknowns and risks, and concerns about the impact on productivity and quality in business. And compared to the people who were in the markets, they were much more concerned about some of these things than the average group was. The people who were already in those markets, some of them were concerned about offsetting poor behaviour of your big fossil fuel companies and the like. Others were worried about data sovereignty. They were finding the technical methods they're required to use hard to understand, things of that nature. And then on the positive side of things, they were all identifying as stewards, these early adopters involved in these programs, and land management stewards who saw a pathway where they could do a productive farm, but also a nature positive farm. They were interested in transitioning to more diversified, sustainable business models. They believe strongly in leaving their land in a better condition than they got it, and they are enjoying learning new skills and knowledge. But some of these things in blue were much more important to the current people who are already experiencing these things, and the people who were not yet doing it. And it sort of helps us understand some of the different motivations and drivers that might need to be addressed and communicated to get people involved. Upfront and short-term benefits are always a big thing for farmers too. Things like normative expectations and seeing farms like theirs. And then again, for the people who are considering but not yet doing it, that lack of credible and clear information on rights and obligations, the lack of trusted advisors, having an affordable and trusted monitoring, verification, reporting provider, these all loomed large. And so I hope that begins to illustrate to you how it's useful to begin to expand beyond the purely individual and behavioural drivers at the farm level to how that maps out to their local community, to the governance sector, and even their engagement with the natural systems which they're doing their work within. A second tool I'll very briefly share is something we produced, particularly in the sustainability transition space. And really here we were looking at this question of, well, there is this interesting dynamic literature and increasing policy impact, particularly in the EU, where many of you are dialing in from, of transitions. But what are they saying about behaviour? And for those of you who are less familiar with it, sustainability transitions are long-term, multi-dimensional and fundamental transformative processes. Essentially, how do we get from this high impact, high throughput train wreck that we're on right now to a more sustainable pathway. And it's inherently involving purposeful and intended change, involving a broad range of actors that need to work together in coordinated ways in a guided transition and cuts across politics, regulation, institutional support. But it also includes end users, consumers, citizens in those things too. And essentially what we're doing in this project, we were trying to understand to what extent and how does the transitions literature engage with behaviour? The answer was not very much, less than 5% of papers. To the extent it does, it's mainly through that sort of practice lens I was talking about before, that's very critical of individualising behaviour and is more interested in how practices extend across scales, which is a very useful and important perspective. But is, I would argue, maybe a little bit more focused on describing problems than helping design interventions and policies that might address them. And in essence, what we summarized out of that literature was that there was, out of the 5% of some 2,000 or so text that was on behavior and practices, it was useful to think maybe in a few different lenses that you could shuffle around the problem. So there's the reflective kind of lens, which is your more sort of considered social psychological, not necessarily rational, but reasoned perspective on things. There's the more automatic perspective, which is your classic habits and nudges and interactions, with some interesting intersections with practice and others. They're quite interested in habits and routines as well. Then there's the more everyday perspective, which aligns with anthropological and practice-oriented perspectives and really emphasize the shared meanings and materials and interactions across structures. And then this more strategic one, which looks at how different players in a system are strategically trying to advance or manipulate things to produce an interest. And you might be looking at sludges, intended and unintended consequences, and who wins and who loses from these situations. And what we're suggesting is simply that this can be a useful set of questions that you can apply to a given problem as a quick way of thinking through beyond individuals, what's going on out there, and also what aspects of the problem might be more conscious and reflective versus more automatic at that individual level as well. And so the example we give here is running it as a quick assessment for questions you can ask about how we're going to retrofit millions of Australian homes by 2030, which is like with many countries, if we're going to reach our Paris targets, we need to retrofit a substantial stock of housing to do it. Not unrelated to your project, Selena, you were telling me about earlier on in the call.
Stefan, just a tiny time check, just so we make sure we have enough time to do the breakout session as well.
Yes. Look at that. Here we are. So
perfect.
Encourage you to look at the paper. So what we're doing next, I hope that sort of whetted your appetite. These tools don't have to be in academic publications to be credible and worthy. You might have done something on the back of an envelope you want to share. Maybe you don't even have a name for what you're doing, but you think it works and you want to talk about it. So don't feel like it's got to be those more formal frameworks and approaches, but would love to hear about whatever you're doing. We're going to break you up into smaller groups. We're going to have these 3 questions of, to what extent are you aware or engaged with some of these criticisms and issues? Are there other things you're more worried about? We're certainly keen to hear about what practical solutions and workarounds you've developed to engage successfully with systems and complex problems. And we're also really interested in what skills and capabilities and tools and relationships we might need to address these things better through your experience. And we'll take about 20 minutes to discuss that in small groups, and then we'll reconvene as a group to do a quick summary and report back